I need you to stay with me for just a moment before I begin tonight. Because what I'm about to tell you doesn't start with a haunted forest or a dark road or anything that you can put a comfortable distance between yourself and. It starts in a room that exists in every city, in every town, in every small corner of this country where people live and eventually stop living. A room that is clean, a room that is bright, a room built around the principle that what enters it is finished, that the biology has concluded, that the processes have stopped, that the thing on that table is now only an object, a form, something the living will grieve, but that will not itself do anything further. The preparation room of a funeral home, the embalming suite, the place where licensed, trained, credentialed professionals go to work in the absolute certainty that the only variable in the room is themselves, because everything else has already ended. Tonight I have 3 accounts from embalmers and morticians who worked that room alone at night, who believed exactly what their training taught them to believe, and who encountered something between midnight and morning that their training had no language for. Not a haunting in the popular sense, not flickering lights or cold drafts or the suggestion of a presence. Something specific. Something that used the room, something that communicated, something that knew things it could not have known because the only person in that building who could have known them had been pronounced dead hours before. 3 stories. 3 preparation rooms. 3 professionals who have spent years since these nights trying to find a version of events that fits inside a rational framework and who have never quite managed it. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. The table is ready. Let's begin. Most people go their entire lives without spending a single moment inside an embalming room. They know it exists, the way you know a hospital operating theater exists, or a forensic laboratory, or any of the other clinical spaces where trained professionals do the quiet, necessary work that keeps the living world functioning. But knowing a space exists and knowing what it actually feels like to be alone inside it at 2 in the morning are 2 very different things. An embalming suite is cold in the way that only rooms designed for cold can be cold. Not the uncomfortable cold of a house in winter, but the deliberate, engineered cold of a space where warmth is the enemy, where any increase in temperature is a problem to be corrected. It is bright with the specific, unforgiving brightness of fluorescent overheads designed so that no shadow falls anywhere on the central table, because the person working there needs to see everything. It smells of chemicals, formaldehyde, cavity fluid, disinfectant, in a combination that is so particular to this specific environment that anyone who has ever worked in it will recognize it anywhere for the rest of their lives. And it is quiet. Not just quiet the way a room is quiet when no one is talking. Quiet in the way that a room is quiet when nothing inside it is breathing. Tonight, 3 people who know that room, who spent years inside it, who know every sound it makes and every smell it carries and every shadow it casts, are going to tell you what happened when the room did something it was not supposed to do. This is True Terror Files Official, and tonight the preparation room is open. Ruth had held a licensed embalmer certification in the state of Vermont for 23 years. And in those 23 years, she had prepared more than 4,000 bodies for burial. She was not a person who brought her feelings to work in any visible way, not because she lacked them, but because she had long ago understood that the job required a particular kind of compartmentalization that she had trained herself to maintain. She worked the late shift at Caldwell Family Funeral Services in Burlington, a mid-sized operation that handled on average 2 to 4 cases per week, and she worked those hours alone because she preferred them. The building was quieter after 10. The phone didn't ring. She could focus. The case she received on a Thursday in late November was a man named Harold Crane, 71 years old, retired school teacher, died of natural causes at home, found by his daughter the following morning in his armchair with his reading glasses still on his face. A gentle death, a quiet end. Harold arrived at the funeral home at 7 in the evening, and Ruth signed the intake paperwork, confirmed the death certificate, and began her initial assessment before setting him aside to complete the refrigeration protocol before her preparation shift began at midnight. Harold was a small man, compact, lean, with the particular stillness of the recently deceased that Ruth had stopped consciously noticing about a decade into the job. She laid his hands at his sides, made her initial notations in the case file, left the preparation room at 11:45 to collect her supply tray from the storage room at the end of the hall. She was gone for less than 4 minutes. When she returned and pushed through the preparation room door and took 3 steps toward the table, she stopped. Harold Crane's hands were no longer at his sides. They were folded across his chest, right hand over left, the way a person folds their hands when they are cold and trying to keep warm, the way a person settles into a comfortable resting position. The position Ruth had seen on 1,000 bodies arranged by grieving family members at viewings. Not a position she had placed him in, because she had not yet begun the preparation. And not a position a body achieves on its own, because the physical processes that produce involuntary movement had been completed hours before Harold arrived at the funeral home. Ruth stood at the table for a long moment and then performed the specific kind of mental reset that 23 years in the profession makes. Available, the deliberate re-examination of her own actions, the careful reconstruction of what she had done and in what order, the methodical elimination of the possibility that she had simply misremembered. She had not placed Harold's hands on his chest. She was certain of this. She had noted the position of the hands in her initial assessment. This was standard protocol, documented in her own handwriting in the case file, and the notation "red hands at sides, palms inward." She picked up the file. It said exactly that. She repositioned Harold's hands at his sides, confirmed the notation, and went back to the storage room to retrieve a piece of equipment she had forgotten. She was gone for 6 minutes this time. She counted them at the supply shelf because some part of her had already decided that counting was something she needed to do. When she returned, Harold's hands were folded on his chest again. Same position, same deliberate placement, right over left. Ruth set her supply tray on the counter and stood at the far wall of the preparation room with her back against it and looked at the table for approximately 90 seconds. Then she crossed to the table and unfolded his hands and placed them at his sides. And this time, she did not leave the room. She stood at the counter and worked from there, keeping the table in her peripheral vision, and for 40 minutes nothing changed. She began the preparation. She was midway through the arterial injection when she needed a specific instrument from the drawer on the opposite wall, and turned her back to the table for the approximately 12 seconds it took to locate and retrieve it. When she turned back, Harold's hands were on his chest. She did not reposition them again. She completed the preparation with his hands folded, because she had run out of a particular kind of willingness to test what would happen the next time she turned around. She told no one. She completed the case file, documented the preparation as standard, and listed the hand position as folded on chest per family preference. She had not spoken to the family. There had been no family preference communicated. At 4 in the morning, as she was completing her final documentation, she looked up and noticed something between Harold's folded hands that had not been there when she began the preparation. A photograph small, the size of a wallet photo, slightly worn at the edges, pressed between the palms. She had never seen it before, was not on his person when he arrived. The preparation room had been locked during the entire shift, accessible only through the door she had used, and a secondary exit secured from the inside. She picked up the photograph with a gloved hand. It showed a young woman and a small child, a girl, perhaps 3 years old, in a garden in summer, both squinting into the sun. Neither person matched anyone on Harold Crane's family file, which listed his daughter as next of kin and made no mention of a grandchild. Ruth photographed the photograph with her phone before logging it in the case file as personal item found with deceased. Origin unknown. She submitted it to the funeral home director the following morning with a note indicating it had been recovered from the body during preparation. The director, a practical man who had been in the business for 30 years, held it for a moment and then called Harold's daughter to ask if the photograph belonged to her father. The daughter did not recognize the photograph. She said her father had never had grandchildren. She said he had been widowed 20 years ago and had no close remaining family beyond herself. She asked where the photograph had come from. The funeral home director said it had been found among Harold's personal effects. He did not specify where. The photograph was placed in an envelope with Harold Crane's case file. Ruth asked a colleague in the office to run a quiet search of the photograph against the funeral home's records, a reach she knew. But something she needed to do in order to put the question anywhere but inside her own head. 3 days after Harold's funeral, the colleague came back with something. The girl in the photograph, based on the approximate age, the era suggested by the image quality, and the specific garden visible in the background matched a photograph on file from a burial the funeral home had conducted 31 years earlier. A young woman who had died in a car accident at the age of 26. Harold Crane's wife, the little girl standing beside her in the photograph, the one who would have been approximately 3 years old in the year the photograph was taken, was Harold's daughter, who had confirmed she did not recognize the photograph, which meant she had never seen it, which meant Harold had kept it somewhere in the 20 years since his wife's death that his daughter had never found. Ruth told me she has 2 explanations she returns to, and she switches between them depending on the hour and her state of mind. The first is that the photograph was concealed somewhere on Harold's body in a manner her initial assessment failed to detect, and that the repositioning of the hands was a trick of memory and the particular unreliable quality of a midnight shift. The second explanation she does not say out loud. She has been working in the profession for 23 years. Oh, she's still working it. She has not taken a solo overnight shift since that November. Michael had been the director and primary operator of Hargrove Funeral Home in Savannah, Georgia for 11 years, a small, family-owned operation he had taken over from his mentor after completing his mortuary science degree at 32, in which he had run with the methodical calm of someone who understands that the work requires a steady hand and a certain willingness to be the person in the room that nobody wants to need. He handled intake, arrangement consultations, preparation assistance, and the administrative work that keeps a small funeral home functioning, and he did most of it alone. The case of Clara Whitmore arrived on a Monday in March. Clara was 64 years old, retired librarian who had died of a sudden cardiac event at her home over the weekend, and whose daughter had contacted the funeral home the same morning to begin arrangements. Clara was a pleasant case in the specific sense of that term. Straightforward paperwork, family who communicated clearly. A service planned for the following Friday, modest and dignified in the way that Clara's daughter said her mother had always wanted. Michael completed the arrangements, confirmed the details, handled the preparation across 2 evenings. and directed Clara's funeral service on the following Friday with the same quiet professionalism he brought to every service he had ever conducted. He filed the case. He closed the file. He moved the case folder to the completed archive. On the 6th day after Clara's burial, a Thursday evening, Michael was alone in the funeral home office, completing intake documentation for an upcoming case when his desk phone rang. This was not unusual in itself. The funeral home maintained a published number that families called at any hour, but the name on the caller ID screen was unusual. Because the caller ID screen displayed Clara Whitmore's name and Clara Whitmore's telephone number, and Clara Whitmore had been in the ground for 6 days. Michael looked at the caller ID display for 4 rings before he answered. Those 4 rings were the time it took his mind to complete the process of verifying what he was seeing and concluding that the answer was not a technical error or a misread. The name was correct. The number was correct. He had called that number himself the week before, when confirming the flower delivery with Clara's daughter, and Clara's daughter had answered because she was staying at her mother's house managing the estate. He answered on the 5th ring. The voice on the other end was not Clara's daughter. It was female, quieter than Clara's daughter's voice, with an older quality. Not elderly, but closer to Clara's age than to her daughter's, and it said 2 things. Michael. Not Mr. Hargrove, not Hargrove Funeral Home, not the standard greeting anyone calling a funeral home would use. His first name, said with the particular familiarity of someone who knows you well enough to use it without thinking. Then, after a pause that Michael described as 3 seconds, but which felt much longer in the telling, it said a 7-digit number, not a phone number. The cadence was wrong for a phone number. The spacing between digits too even. Read out the way you read a reference number or a file code, rather than a number you want someone to dial. Then the call ended. The line went dead. Michael sat at his desk for approximately 5 minutes and did not move. Then he called Clara's daughter from his cell phone. Her voice, he confirmed immediately, was nothing like what he had just heard. She had not called the funeral home. She was at her sister's house in Charleston. She had not been at her mother's house in 3 days. She had not authorized anyone else to use her mother's telephone. Michael told her there had been an accidental misdial from the number and apologized for calling late. He set his phone down and looked at the desk phone and its caller ID screen, which still displayed the most recent incoming call, Clara Whitmore's name and number. Call duration 2 minutes and 14 seconds. He wrote the 7-digit number on the notepad on his desk and stared at it for a long time. The next morning, he asked his administrative assistant, without explaining why, to run the 7-digit number against the funeral home's case management software to see whether it corresponded to anything. The administrative assistant came back to him within the hour with an expression he has described as carefully neutral in the way that people are. Carefully neutral when they don't want to alarm someone. The 7-digit number was a case file identifier, not an existing case, a case that had been generated by the funeral home's newly implemented digital management system 2 days after Clara Whitmore's burial. As part of a routine batch assignment of future identifiers by the software, the system pre-generated blocks of case numbers to prepare for incoming cases, assigning them in advance to a queue. The number Clara had given him, if Clara had given it to him, corresponded to a case number that the software had created after her death, from a system that had not been installed until after her funeral, and which had assigned that specific identifier to an empty slot in the queue, a future case not yet associated with any name or intake date. Sitting in the system waiting for the next person to require the funeral home services, that case number was assigned to a name 17 days after the phone call. A woman named Dorothy Reeves, 61 years old. who died of a stroke on a Wednesday afternoon and whose family contacted Hargrove Funeral Home the same evening. Michael processed the intake. He assigned the case number, recognized it when the system generated it. He went very still at his desk and then opened his desk drawer and retrieved the notepad page he had kept since the Thursday evening of the phone call, and confirmed the number against the one now displayed on his computer screen. They were identical. He completed Dorothy Reeves's case with full professionalism. He told no one about the telephone call for 3 years. He told us because, he said, he had reached a point where carrying it alone had become heavier than the risk of telling it. Diane was a licensed mortician with 15 years of experience at the time of the account she shared with us. Working at Meridian Mortuary Services in Champaign, Illinois, a mid-sized facility that handled both private funeral services and county contracts, including cases referred by the medical examiner's office. She had worked solo night shifts for most of her career, a preference she had developed early for the same reasons Ruth had. The building was quieter, the work was uninterrupted, and the hours suited the particular rhythm of how she did her best thinking. She did not find the work frightening. She found it honest. She has told people who ask her about the job that working with the dead has made her less afraid of death, not more, and that she considers that a gift. The case of Amanda Reyes arrived on a Friday evening in January. Amanda was 29 years old, a graduate student at the University of Illinois, who had died that afternoon in a single vehicle. Collision on a county road 40 minutes outside the city. The accident had occurred at 3:47 p.m. Amanda was pronounced dead at the scene at 4:12 p.m. by the responding paramedic unit. She arrived at the mortuary at 7:30 p.m. with a standard intake packet from the county, the death certificate, the medical examiner's preliminary notation, the accident report. No next of kin had yet been reached. The family notification was being handled by the county sheriff's office. Diane logged the intake, completed the initial assessment, and began the preliminary preparation, working methodically and without particular incident until approximately 2:10 a.m., when she needed to retrieve a specific instrument from the supply cabinet in the hallway just outside the preparation room. She propped the door open. She could see the cabinet and the preparation room simultaneously from the hallway, and was gone for no more than 45 seconds. The refrigeration unit in Diane's preparation room was a standard mortuary cooler, a bank of 4 stacked drawers with glass panel doors. Used for holding cases that were not yet in active preparation, Amanda Reyes was on the preparation table, not in the cooler. The cooler was empty that evening. Diane had confirmed this during her initial sweep of the room before beginning work. A standard safety check. The cooler doors were closed. The glass panels were slightly fogged on the interior surface from the temperature differential between the coolers. Interior in the room, a normal and expected condition at that hour in that environment. One Diane had observed thousands of times and stopped consciously noticing years ago. When she returned from the hallway and came back through the propped door, the glass panel of the second drawer from the bottom was different. She saw it from across the room before she had taken more than 2 steps back inside. Not because the change was large, but because the fog on the glass panel, which had been uniform when she left, was now interrupted. 3 words had been written in the condensation on the interior surface of the glass. It's written from inside the drawer. It's written at the height a person's hand would reach if they were lying. Inside and pressing their fingers against the glass above them. The letters were uneven but deliberate, the kind of uneven that comes from writing in an awkward position. not the kind that comes from a random disturbance of condensation. Diane stood 3 feet from the cooler and read the 3 words without approaching any closer, because every professional instinct she possessed was producing a specific, unfamiliar signal that she has since described as the body knowing something before the mind catches up. The word said, "Check the car." She stood in the preparation room for a long time after that. Then she took out her phone and photographed the glass panel, because she understood, even in that moment, that whatever happened next would require documentation. Then she called the Champaign County Sheriff's non-emergency line and asked, in the careful language of someone who knows they are saying something that will sound impossible, whether there was anything in Amanda Reyes's vehicle that might still be relevant to the case. The deputy she spoke with at 2:40 a.m. was patient with her, in the way that people in positions of authority are patient with someone they have not yet decided is credible. He took down her name and the mortuary's address and told her he would pass the message to the detective assigned to the accident case. The detective, a man named Garrett, who had processed the accident scene that afternoon, called her back at 8:15 a.m. the following morning, and when Diane walked him through what she had found and showed him the photograph on her phone. The call went very quiet on his end. Garrett drove to the impound lot where Amanda Reyes's vehicle was being held as standard evidence pending the accident investigation. He had processed the car himself the previous afternoon and had flagged nothing of note, a clean scene. Consistent with a single vehicle accident, no indication of any other party involved. He searched the car again. Under the driver's seat, pushed to the furthest point from the door, was a cell phone. Amanda's personal phone, which had not been logged in the original evidence inventory because it had not been visible in the initial search. The phone was passworded, but Garrett obtained emergency access through the carrier within the hour. The call log showed 47 missed calls beginning at 4:31 p.m., 19 minutes after Amanda Reyes had been pronounced dead at the scene. All 47 calls were from Amanda's mother, who had not yet been reached by the sheriff's office and who had been calling. Every number she had for her daughter since the time Amanda was supposed to have arrived for a scheduled video call and didn't. The most recent item on the phone was not a missed call. It was an outgoing text message sent from Amanda's number at 4:31 p.m. to 19 minutes after the declared time of death to Amanda's mother's number. The message was 3 words. It said, "I'm so cold." The medical examiner reviewed the case timeline and noted the discrepancy. The technical explanation offered was a delayed message, sent a text composed before the accident that failed to transmit due to poor rural signal coverage, and finally sent when the phone connected to a cell tower. It is a technically possible explanation. Garrett told Diane this when he called her with the findings. He said it was the explanation that would go in the report. He said it was the explanation that made sense. He did not say he believed it. Diane still has the photograph of the cooler door on her phone. She has not deleted it in the years since. She said she has thought many times about whether to. And she always concludes that deleting it would feel like deciding something she has not yet fully decided. 3 preparation rooms. 3 professionals with decades of experience between them. People who have spent their careers in the most certain rooms that exist. Rooms built around the premise that finality is real and absolute, and that the body on the table is beyond communication of any kind. And in each case, something communicated anyway. Ruth's hands. Michael's call. Diane's 3 words, and the text that arrived after death. The official explanations exist for all 3 of these accounts. Involuntary muscle contraction, caller ID spoofing, delayed message delivery. Each explanation is technically possible. Each one accounts for one piece of the account and leaves the rest sitting in a corner of the room, unaddressed. What we do not know, what these three people do not know, despite the years they have spent turning these experiences over in the dark, is whether the finality we build our rituals around is as complete as we have decided it is. Whether the person on the preparation table is as gone as the biology suggests, whether there is some window in the hours between death and burial, when something that was a person still has access to the world it is leaving and chooses to use what it has left. Ruth thinks about Harold's photograph. Michael thinks about a 7-digit number. Diane thinks about 3 words written from inside an empty drawer. They think about these things because they have no choice. They are professionals. They process the evidence. And the evidence in each case does not fully close. If you work in a field where you encounter death medicine, emergency services, mortuary work, hospice care, and something has happened during those hours that no protocol was designed to explain, we want to hear from you. The comment section is yours. We read every account and we take every one of them seriously, because the people who work the night shift in rooms like these are the most credible witnesses we have. The last people we would expect to be telling these stories. And for that reason, the people we most believe when they do. Subscribe to True Terror Files official new horror every week. Built for the hours when the house goes quiet and the dark goes deep. And some of the accounts still waiting to be told are the ones that took the longest to surface because the people who lived them needed time to be ready. We'll be here when they are. Hit the like button if tonight's stories got inside the walls. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And check your doors. Every last one of them. Good night.